Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshana b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And welcome. As we continue to look carefully into, excuse me 1 second, I'm going to have to do something here, into the details regarding the sacrifice, the Olah, specifically the Olah sacrifice. And then when it's a calf, essentially, that's brought as an Olah sacrifice. So let me go to the screen share and hopefully see. Yep, there it is. So they've dashed the blood. They've brought it and put on the sides of the altar, and here we are. So we're back at the animal itself. Vehifshit et haolah. They should flay, in other words, remove the skin. So I think the word fillet and the word flay are actually basically mean the same thing. It means removing the skin. They should remove the skin of the Olah, v'nitach ota lintacheha, and should cut the Olah into its parts. Let's take a look at Rashi. Vehifshit et haolah. Ma Talmud Loma ha'olah. So the question is, why, again, instead of using a pronoun, why does the Torah use ha'olah? Uses the definite article and at the same time talks about the Olah once again. Lerabot et kol ha'olot, okay, to include all other olot, lehefshet v'nituach, that they all require to be flayed and to be cut into parts. So this would include olot. Some of the olot are mandatory olot, and some of the olot are personal olot, etc. So it's just saying that any of this species of olah requires flaying. Okay. Ota lintacheha. She, okay, so here we're using a pronoun, right? Into its parts. V'lo netachea lentachim. So it's being very specific. You cut it up, into its parts, but not the parts into further parts. In other words, you're not just chopping away. You're cutting it in a very deliberate kind of way. And who knows, there may in fact be some kind of formula for how those parts are to be actually cut apart, at any rate. But we just know so much. It's not a chopping business. It's just cutting it into parts. V'natnu b'nei Aharon HaKohen, and the sons of Aaron the priest shall place Eish al Mizbeach, fire on the altar. Va'archu eitzim, and they should set up, arrange wood al ha'esh, on the fire. Back into the Rashi that we've got. V'natnu eish, they shall place fire. Afal pi sheha'esh yoredet min hashamayim. This is, I thought you'd find this interesting. Even though the fire comes down from heaven to ignite the altar, mitzvah lahavi min hahedyot. It is still a mitzvah for a regular person to bring fire. And that sort of is so interesting, right? The idea that we don't just depend on God, in other words, to whatever extent, even though we are, in fact, so dependent on God for everything that we do, our consciousness, the way our bodies function, etc., etc. Nevertheless, there's that little spark inside of ourselves that is capable of doing things. And to that extent, this is the necessity. So if I needed a verse to speak against quietism, right, which means basically doing nothing, fa niente, in Italian, I believe. This would be a Rashi to take, that we don't just depend on God's miracles as much as we understand and believe in them, etc. Whatever we are capable of doing for ourselves, we should do. Ne Aharon HaKohen. So you didn't know that the Aaron they're going to talk about was a Kohen. So children of Aaron the priest. So it says Aharon HaKohen Keshehu Bekihu No. So what this essentially means is when he is in his regalia as a priest. Ha'im avad bivigdei kohen hedyot. So in other words, if as the high priest, he served at the altar with the dress, the regalia of a regular priest, not a high priest. Avodato psula, his service has no effect whatsoever. It is invalid. So this is how they're understanding why it says Aharon HaKohen, right? Because Aaron, of course, was the very first high priest. Moving on. See how much we still have to plow through. So, going on. Va'archu b'nei Aharon haKohanim. And again, right, look at this phrase here. And the sons of Aaron, the priests. Right? Before it was the sons of Aaron, the priest. Now it's the sons of Aaron, the priests. Should arrange, or must arrange, et hanitachim, the pieces, et harosh, the head of the animal, the et hapader, and the suet. I needed to look up the word suet. Suet is a heavy fat that essentially covers the kidneys and the loins of an animal. And I had mentioned to Harlan yesterday that although we know, and he mentioned how we are forbidden to consume blood, I explained that there's two types of blood. There's dam tamtzit, and there's dam hanefesh. Dam hanefesh is the thick blood. Dam tamtzit is a much thinner, the kind of blood you see when you get into a piece of steak or something like that. The latter is not forbidden. Likewise with fat, there is suet, there is something called chelev, which refers to this very hard type of fat, and there's shomen, which is the stuff they make chicken fat out of, all right? But even in an animal, there's the kind of fat that is in the muscle that is not this identifiable fat that is on these inner parts of the animal. At any rate, they should take all the pieces of the animal that they've cut up. They should take the head and the suet, al ha'itzim. They should arrange them on the wood, asher al ha'esh, which is on the fire, asher al hamizbeach, which is on the altar. So, some questions about this. So first of all, it says Bnei Aharon HaKohanim, right? It says the sons of Aaron, the priests, plural. And again, the same idea, Keshehem Bekihunam. In other words, when they're dressed in their regalia. There is a uniform that one has to wear when you're ministering at the altar. Understand, this is all a way of showing respect. So for sure, how we dress can be a very important nonverbal way, a powerful way of nonverbally communicating our respect, or the opposite, obviously. In this case, of course, respect. Ha kohen hediot shavad bishmona b'gadim. So consequently, from the positive, we infer the negative. The negative is that if a regular priest, not a high priest, ministers at the altar with the 8 garments, in other words, the 8 garments that are relegated to the high priest, avodato pesula, his service is also null and void. It has no effect whatsoever. Now, et hanetachim et harosh. So he says the pieces and the head. Well, isn't the head a piece? So the answer is the fi she'ein harosh bichlal hefshet, because he says the reason because the head would not have been included when they flayed the animal, when they removed the skin of the animal. Shekvar hutaz b'shchita, because it is already removed. Hutaz would mean severed when it was slaughtered. I looked at the Art Scroll. The Art Scroll English translation is actually quite excellent. It includes some commentary, light commentary on Rashi as well. In this particular case, of course, here, if we were just reading the Rashi, if I hadn't checked the Art Scroll, I would have understood it to mean completely severed. Art Scroll points out that shchita does not sever the head of the animal. It merely renders it unconscious and, of course, dead. But the idea of shchita is that the moment you put the knife at the neck of the animal and draw it across the windpipe and the esophagus, it basically it's done. It goes into it loses consciousness immediately. Okay, so you don't completely sever the head. In fact, I suspect if you were to do that, the shchita would perhaps not even be considered kosher. At any rate, however, there is a principle that when it's essentially that the effect of it is to sever it. Here we go. I've got the little footnote here. Not actually severed, but the act of shechita rendered the head as good as severed. And we have such concepts in halacha, where even if the whole thing isn't done, there is the effect of the actual part of the deed may be the actual considered to have the halachic validity of the entire deed. So he says, regardless, because the shechita basically renders it as if it was completely severed, and that's why he has to mention the head all by itself, along with the other parts. The et hapader and the suet. Lama ne'emar. So again, is this part of the animal? Clear answer is yes. Why does the Torah mention it explicitly? That's the question. Lelamedcha, to teach you, shema alehu im harosh, that you remove it, you put it up on the altar together with the head, umechaseh bo et beit hashchita, and you cover with the fat the place where the shechita, in other words, that particular cut is covered up by this fat. And why? V'zehu derech kavod shamala. And this is considered a way of showing respect to God, essentially, is what they're saying. That we don't leave the cut where the shechita took place exposed on the altar. Asher ala mizbech, which is on the altar. This was on the wood, which is on the fire, which is on the altar. Shelo ha'ihiyu hagzirin yotzin chutz lamaracha. And what they're saying here is that the way this is done is that this all has to be placed. Nothing should be sticking outside the area of where the arrangement of wood is on the altar. You don't want either pieces of wood that they put on it or pieces of the animal that are sticking out. They're all supposed to be on the wood. And my assumption would be that the idea is that they're all supposed to be burnt. And that's the reason why it's called a whole offering, because the entire animal is offered up. I was trying to think about the symbolism of the fat and of the blood. Clearly, the Torah explicitly says that the blood represents the life of the animal. But what does the fat represent? And essentially, these two parts, the fat and some parts of the entrails, are also offered up in all animal sacrifices involved, certainly the fat of the animal and possibly other parts as well. But regardless, it's always the fat. And I was thinking to myself, what could be the symbolism of the fat? And some of you may, in fact, have some other ideas as well. But I was thinking that the fat in some ways, when you use the expression, for example, living off the fat of the land, that the idea of fat is it has to do with extra blessing, with stuff that represents additional levels of benefit and lifestyle and things like that. It represents in some ways the best parts in that regard. And in some ways, if we were saying that offering up the fat of the animal was symbolically that we're trying to offer up the best of this. Again, we said yesterday, the greatest gift you can give is yourself. But yourself can have all kinds of qualities. And if you offer the best of yourself, that is even, a step ahead, a step beyond. We'll go on. Again, I feel I'm only scratching the surface. Okay. V'kirbo uchra'av, yirchatz b'mayim. So I should have said innards and not entrails, because the entrails, of course, involve the intestines and things like that. Okay, those pieces. V'kirbo, so it's entrails, uchra'av, and its legs. Yirchatz b'mayim. He should wash them in water. Ve'iktir hakohenet hakol hamizbecha, and the priest should turn it all into smoke. Iktir, right? Haktara should turn it all into smoke. All hakol hamizbecha, on the altar. Olah, it is an olah. It's considered an olah. Ishe, it's a fire by fire. Reach nichoach, of pleasing fragrance to Hashem. Well, this is definitely very anthropomorphic. We don't really believe that God has nostrils and that God really is into this. We are really talking symbolism here. And I think the reason why it uses this particular expression is that we know how powerfully we can be affected by fragrances and by smells, how there is something very satisfying about a really wonderful, wonderful fragrance. And that's why it's using it. It's trying to get across the level of satisfaction that is involved in doing this between the human being and heaven. And Rashi is going to go into this a little bit. What is the satisfaction? Olah, in other words, l'shem olah, he needs to do this. When he does it, when he performs these actions, he needs to do it with the intent that he is performing an olah sacrifice. In other words, when he cut yaktirenu, when he causes it to smoke, he has to do it for the sake of an olah, that consciously done in that regard. Ishe, a fire offering. Kesheyishchatenu, okay, when he slaughters the animal, Yehei shochto l'shem ha'esh, he needs to slaughter it fully knowing and consciously that it's going to be burned, right? He needs to do that consciously. So we are really talking about, again, I mentioned this before, a very high degree of mindfulness. And even though I've never seen a Hebrew term for mindfulness per se, nevertheless, it is what we're talking about. V'chol ishe lashon esh, he says.
Rabbi,
yes.
What does kavanah mean?
Intent.
And that's not related to mindfulness?
It is actually, Lauren, you make a very good point. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. You're right. I've just never seen it translated as mindfulness. And when I came across the term mindfulness, it just, the connotations of that term just switched on a whole bunch of thoughts, whereas intention or concentration or stuff like that, there's something, in other words, there was something about the term mindfulness that I found very helpful in terms of, as opposed to, because I believe it's used in opposition to emotion. In other words, I believe that that term is used to speak in, as opposed to allowing your emotions to just carry you along.
So interesting. I was just looking up, etymologically speaking, the word foyer because of the Rashi's note about the Old French that we're coming to,
yes.
Meaning fire.
Yes.
So I assumed that it was related to fire, but I found out that not only is that word related to fire, but the word focus is related. So
wow.
Interesting, really interesting in light of what we're talking about.
Yes. That is so cool. I mean, these are sort of little pearls that come out of what we're studying. Thank you. But
yeah, it was the point of convergence, and it was related to hearth or fireplace.
Hmm.
So, the FOC, I guess, of the word focus is related to the well, in Foyer, it says see focus.
Hmm.
Focus with a hearth.
Hmm.
And
By
it's
the way,
for furnace, for focarium, all this stuff. Really
right,
cool.
it is. It is. Um, I want to say something also. This is just totally tangentially, but some of you may be familiar with something that's called the Yule Log. This, instead of the Christmas tree, this is actually a Christian practice. It is actually taken from pagan custom, but nevertheless, there's certain universal symbolism that's involved, and the idea of taking the Yule log and putting it in the hearth and having the smoke go up the chimney. Both the chimney and the Christmas tree represent, of course, a nexus between heaven and earth. And the reason for the Christmas tree particularly is because it's an evergreen. And of course, winter represents death and green represents life. And so these things come to represent immortality. It's all connected, let me tell you. It really is. So, really, and I think that's one reason why there's a certain, how can I put it, level of satisfaction in discussing these kinds of things, in that we're not limiting ourselves and our minds to simply the here and now, but even I think subconsciously, we're taking into account levels of existence and consciousness that may not even be something that we can express directly. At any rate, but thank you, Lauren, for bringing that out. Okay, here we go. Nichoach, right? Nichoach. Pleasant, acceptable, delightful, something like that. Pleasing odor is how it's translated, right? Let's go on, see what Rashi says about this. And I think he totally gets it. Nachat ruach, right? Maybe you've heard of nachas, the Yiddish word nachas. It comes from this expression, Hebrew, nachat ruach. By the way, literally it means one's spirit coming down, coming down. But in this sense, meaning that you're not agitated. It's the opposite of being agitated, and that you can relax and enjoy, think of Shabbos, etc. So so acceptability, something like that. It's a pleasure, right? Lifanai, Rashi is speaking as in the name of Hashem. He says it is a pleasure before me. Sha'amarti. Here's the point, right? Sha'amarti, that I said to do this. V'ne'asa retzoni, and my will is being performed, because we know that basically the human attitude is ain't nobody, etc., etc. So the fact that this is being done, this could be implying, is this implying possibly that we realize that in some ways it's counterintuitive and that one has to do this in this very conscious and deliberate kind of way? I would have to leave that is in a question. At any rate, we have just talked about taking a calf, essentially, and offering it up as an Olah. But we know that an Olah isn't limited to a calf. And what is interesting, I believe, okay, so let's just go on with the next sentence. And I'm going to stop because we're so close to time. Ve'im min hatzon korbano. But if his offering is from the flock, min haksavim, from the lambs, or min ha'izim, or from the goats, la'olah, for an olah. Again, what can you bring? Zachar tamim, an unblemished male, yakrivenu, he should offer it up as an olah. So we will stop here. And let's see how far, okay, I think I'm just gonna do this. So I have a marking, God willing, we'll start. Now, interestingly enough, we might be able to meet tomorrow because I have to come up to Santa Rosa. So just a heads up, I would like to meet tomorrow if you're available. And I will, God willing, be here at 7:30 tomorrow, and we'll pick this up at that particular point. And let me just do this. Let's see if I can. Okay, let's see if this will work. Yep, there we are. Okay, I'm going to stop the share. And I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you for those of you who joined us this morning.